Welcome and thank you for joining today's conference, Feasibility of Managing Permitting Using EMRS under the Secure Food Supply Plan. Please note that all participant lines will be muted until the Q&A portion of the call. We'll provide you with instructions on how to ask a verbal question at that time. You are welcome to submit written questions during the presentation, and these will be addressed during Q&A. To submit a written question, use the chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen. Choose All Panelists from the Send To drop-down menu. With that, I'll turn the call over to Liz Clark. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for the webinar. I'm Liz Clark with the Professional Development Services Branch. Today, Dr. Fred Bourgeois will review the information generally required for a permit during a FAD response and describe the process for issuing movement permits in past outbreaks. Fred is a veterinarian with USDA, APHIS, VS, Surveillance, Preparedness and Response Services, the National Preparedness and Incident Coordination staff, and he's located in Lake Charles, Louisiana. He received his DVM from LSU in 1985 and owned and operated a mixed practice from 1985 to 1990. Fred has been with USDA since 1990, and he served as a field VMO for 15 years and since 2007 as the EMRS National Coordinator. Dr. Bourgeois supports veterinary services and state field operations in the development and utilization of EMRS for routine FAD and outbreak control activities, along with the EMRS IT team, which consists of 3 EMRS staff specialists and more than 30 network associates. And I will now turn this webinar over to Dr. Bourgeois.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining and giving me an opportunity to discuss permitting. Welcome to 2018. It's kind of hard to believe it's been 18 years since we were all worried about Y2K, but here we are. We've made some progress during that time. This webinar sort of grew out of a number of requests to folks about talking about permitting and some of the exercises that we've been, the ARMOR exercise, the Kansas Phoenix exercise, different ones, where we've had some requests and information, want to know more about using the permitting functions for other commodities and other types of outbreaks. So we wanted to kind of cover that a little bit this morning and talk about what the possibilities may be. I guess one thing I want to make clear right up at the beginning here is we've had a lot of experience with high-path AI. We've got a lot of work in planning that different folks have done from the universities and from VS and from the states on looking at moving commodities during high-path AI. There's been a lot of risk assessment work, a lot of planning work. We have good laboratory testing, a lot of experience with that. So we've done in HiPath 2015 over 20,000 movements that we tracked. We have some states that have a lot of experience, Minnesota, Iowa, in permitting and moving commodities. That's not so much the case with other commodities and other diseases. There has been a lot of work done by different universities and through the secure food supply plans at looking at all these things, but I think we still are, we still have some work to do there. So my main, discussion this morning would be, in what we have used for the high-path AI, the infrastructure we have, how does that apply to other diseases, other commodities? But I'm in no way saying that we have an answer just by using EMRS or just by using the gateway that we're going to solve the issues around permitting, because they're much more complex than that. So my discussion is primarily of how does EMRS and the gateway benefit us in permitting other commodities, but there's still a lot we don't know. I think there's lots of work there to be done with risk assessments and laboratory testing, and we, moving groups of animals and AI with good tests and good risk assessments is about as my opinion, about as simple as you can get. Now, when you start throwing multiple species, multiple pathways, multiple laboratory testing, different incubation periods, all of that on top of moving those things and tracking that information, it becomes much more complex. And, at this point, I couldn't tell you that we have within EMRS all the capabilities to manage everything that we would need for those, because a lot of that has not yet been defined. So caution that up front. The other thing, we've recently had some test exercises, or a number of test exercises over the past couple of years. We started to talk about permitting and other types of disease activities such as foot and mouth disease. And sometimes, first thing off, some folks say, well, we're going to make a whole county a control area. And that's fine if that's what needs to be done. But the consideration you need to have there is, if you're going to require permits from that whole county, now you've exponentially increased the number of permits that need to be done. So I think it's just want to make a point that defining control zones and or zones, infected zones and buffer zones and control areas and all those things have implications for permitting if you're going to permit all of those commodities out of those control areas. So that just needs to be part of the conversation when you decide how big those zones and areas are going to be, realizing that's going to have a big impact on the volume of permitting and what needs to be permitted. And those are decisions that need to be made. How are you going to handle those? Are we going to track every one of those or not? Because it could end up being a huge number of permits and movements. There's different types. We start talking about movements, and there's different types, a lot of different types of movements that occur during outbreaks. We normally handle in the high path, where we've tracked it in EMRS, would be the permitted movements, where we're actually, asking permission to move something, tracking those movements that occur under those permits that have been agreed upon whatever conditions, testing that's required. So those, we track those. We've also tracked conveyances, and this has been more like the product that moves, finished product moving out of an FSIS inspected facility. We consider that's, very low risk product. We track the trucks that are carrying that product to their first point of destination so that we know what's moved and where it's moved to. But we're not really tracking the product itself as far as the lots and the numbers and all that. Most of that occurs through normal industry tracking for food recall purposes. And then there's this routine movements that happen all the time. There's veterinarians on and off the farm, or industry personnel or producers moving on and off the farm. Feed moving on and off, depending on whether it's a control area or not, may or may not be tracked. So it depends on how you define the routine movements and whether you're going to be tracking those. We don't normally ask for permits for, let's say, a company veterinarian to go on and off of a premises. But those are all different types of movements you need to consider how you're going to handle those. And different types of permits as well. During outbreaks, we may have a specific type permit where if we're dealing with an infected premises, some folks say nothing ever moves off an infected premises. Not true. Sometimes we need to move animals to a landfill, or manure to a landfill, or feed to somewhere to be, incinerated. So those are more very highly controlled specific type permits that may or may not be handled through the normal permitting process. Continuity of business permits is more of what we're talking about, is to be able to keep the feed moving onto the farm, to keep the animals moving to slaughter, those type of things that are covered under either your normal operations, operational type permits that are normal things, feed moving on and off, or your secure food supply plans where you're moving your product, moving animals to slaughter, moving the product out. So again, a lot of different moving parts here as far as the types of permits, types of movements. So when we have these discussions about permitting, what are we talking about? We need to be pretty specific about which one of those you're going to actually want to track and need to track. As far as the basic information that's required for a permit that's not a high path permit, in my opinion, there's probably not a lot of difference. Different folks have done work on this. Minnesota and Iowa universities have all taken a look at permitting and defining some of the elements. The different secure food supply plans have defined different elements. I think overall it's pretty much consistency there. I mean, we're talking about who, what, when, where type of stuff. What are we moving it within a control area? Why are you moving it? need an origin and a destination. We need to know what item is being moved. Further defined down if it's animals, what type of animals, and then what kind of duration span are we looking for in that permit? Is it a one-time movement going to occur one day? Are we asking permission to move something every day for 30 days? So those type of elements, I think, are somewhat common across different commodities. But there may be some things that come up that haven't been part of that. I haven't thought of any myself, but there may be some that we, as we further define what products we want to move, how those are going to be moved, then we may have some additional requirements we need to add as far as the infrastructure we have to accommodate those. Again, until we fully define how we're going to move all the different commodities and different diseases, sometimes those things will come up, and we'll maybe find a workaround or have to do something, some type of development to accommodate that. But as we stand right now, it seems that we have the elements covered. Again, just to clarify and go back, permits and permitted movements, we like to think, at least in our world here, we try to define permits as kind of the overall agreement that we're taking a look at a type of commodity moving between two specific premises, kind of look at that overall and risk assessment, make some decisions of whether this is going to be allowed or not, and then define whether it's something that's low enough risk that we can sort of for a period of time between the officials and the locations where the origin and destination are, that if that initial approval will cover a period of time, and then we track those individual movements during that period of time. The permit approval process may be, okay, we're going to allow this to move. Here's the conditions it's going to move under. We're going to need tests occurring, like with high path, 2 negative PCRs within 48 hours. Whatever the parameters are, we have infrastructure that we can handle those, but dividing this out to high risk and low risk and being able to make multiple movements against a single permit helps to kind of damp down the amount of times we need to touch something, the amount of data we need to enter. So we need to give consideration to that. But we have the infrastructure currently where we can handle a single movement on a single permit or multiple movements on a single permit. One of the things to keep in mind is if you have different types of commodities moving, even if it's between the same premises, then those are considered different permits because we're defining specific item moving between two premises. One item may require testing, the other may not. And if you're moving from a single premises to multiple premises, the same item, those are different locations, destinations. Those require a separate permit because those are located in different areas, and vice versa. If you've got something, like several backgrounders that are sending cattle to a feedlot, those are all different permits. And so looking at this, we always try to look at where is the most efficient place to work from, point of concentration, where we can have one or two people well-trained that can be working on these permits instead of having a lot of different folks involved with every producer trying to request a permit. So again, something you need to consider and think about. We do have the infrastructure that we've handled that both ways. Pre-identified premises has been a huge deal for us in poultry. We've been successful working with the states and industry over the past couple of years, identifying an additional 20,000 most commercial poultry premises. As hard as that process has been, it's, in my opinion, probably the low-hanging fruit, because working with an integrated industry that's willing, at this point, to cooperate, to supply that information to us in a centralized manner is much easier than I think we'll see in other commodities. I mean, swine industry has integration. We may have success with them as well, doing getting folks to submit through their integrators. or directly to the states, whatever, individuals, but it's a little more complex. And then, dairies, there's some integration there with your bulk plants and your brokers. So, again, maybe have ways that can be centralized. But when we get into cattle and sheep and goats and, everybody's an individual type of deal, it gets much more complex of getting those premises in ahead of time, getting them established, and using those premises in a permitting situation where we can somehow centralize that request process so we're not getting each individual making a separate request. And then as we start talking about public land and large ranches that cross state lines and all that, and you start talking permitting, again, it's much more complex than just moving chickens from one to another. But we get into, is this continuity of business permit? Is it a specific permit, like something moving from an infected premises directly, animals moving from infected premises directly to a landfill? That's pretty well controlled, and there's folks on site handling that. But when you start moving from one farm in a control zone in one state to the other state, control zone or not in a control zone to a free area, we've got folks moving on and off of those premises. We've got product or animals moving between farms. We've got animals moving to slaughter. We've got product then moving out of the slaughter channels to retail. So all of those different things need to be thought out. We do have the infrastructure that we've handled that in high path. I think it has, a good bit of transferable to other commodities, but it remains to be seen if we're in an outbreak situation, if we have all the pieces and parts there that we need to have. So the process, I think, is somewhat the same and probably would go across commodities is, producer or someone has to request they want to move something, so they got to make some type of request. Now, we built the gateway primarily for integrated type of industry like the poultry industry, where we would have a large number of requests coming from a centralized location. And so the gateway, that's what it helps do for us, is just to allow someone outside of regulatory producer and industry person to make those requests in a centralized manner, come into the system without additional data entry. We're able to act on those, pass those across state lines, have the state officials do the approvals. That information flows back into the gateway, gives that producer the visibility of what's going on. So that was what the gateway was designed to do. Has generally worked, so far we've only had the chance to actually use it in the outbreak in Tennessee. Seemed to work well. We've done a lot of permitting prior to the gateway in the high path of 2015, and that was the issue we had, was with getting those requests in and getting them in a timely manner and getting them in a centralized location we could deal with them. But seems to have helped us a great deal with that, and I think that would help us in other commodities. But the thing we need to consider is how do we look at those commodities, and make useful of the gateway, versus having everybody just send a request in over email or over a fax or whatever, and you get 3,000 requests and you got to put them into some way that you can handle them. That may be if you get the odds, here and there, one and twosies, if folks need to move something. But we need to be looking and planning on how can we centralize this. Do we train every producer of how to request a permit, or do we train, let's say, if it's dairies, do we use a practitioner and ask him and get him a gateway account where he can request permits for all of his clients? Do we use a bulk plant that knows, or a broker, milk broker, if we're talking about milk, and that they can make those requests in a centralized manner? How can we cut down on the volume of individuals that we need to deal with and make it a more efficient process? But as it goes through, I think the process would follow of making the request. Somebody's got to review that request. Somebody's got to approve that request with certain conditions. and then at some point a movement actually occurs, and you check on if there's testing or additional requirements. And can you, if you're moving milk to the processor every 2 days, do you need to go back to an approval every time they move milk, or are you going to do that and say, okay, it's good for the next 2 weeks and we're going to do it? All of those things would affect how we manage that information. If we do it similar to how we've done it with HiPath, then we may have something there that would work for that situation. So the process itself, I think, again, is similar. Somebody's got to make a request, and whether that's on paper, whether that's an email, whether it's a fax or whatever, it's still the same. It comes across. Advantage the Gateway has given us in poultry has been they can put that request in, and it immediately comes into the system without additional data entry. That goes into a queue, into a view, where then people can start to review that and say, okay, as they come in, I can deal with them. Whereas in past, we maybe got in faxes or we got in emails, and you have to print those, put them in a box, somebody's got to enter them. They get jumbled up. They're not necessarily in the same order. Sometimes they get duplicated. So all of those things, part of the process you need to consider of how you would handle permitting in a different type of outbreak. But if we were being able to utilize something like the Gateway, we bring that in. I think the process from that point is pretty much the same. Start to look at it, you review it. If you think it's a feasible thing and you want to approve it, then the Gateway recipient would be able to see that has moved on to the approval process. If they're going to do multiple movements, then they have the ability to enter those movements without additional lot of data entry, because it's utilizing all the information that's already been given, type of movement and the type of commodity and all of the approvals and everything are there. So that's where it's helped us in that process. And then if they make multiple movements against that, when they've completed their cycle or their approval's up, it's completed permit, completed movements, you move on to the next one. So we had a lot of questions about the Gateway, and if we could have the Gateway for other commodities and how that would help us. And so I guess we've spent a great deal of time with the poultry industry training folks. We have over 600 people in the industry we've trained. We spent a lot of time with different states, trying to promote the aspect that we would centralize this, we would streamline it, we would reduce data entry. But then I'm getting comments now of, if we have the Gateway, we can go ahead and permit hogs, and we can permit, well, theoretically we could, but I want to throw in a little caution here, because it was designed for large volume input, not for the single onesie-twosies. It's possible to have an individual producer have an account, but it probably wouldn't make a lot of sense, because the time we would take in processing their account and getting them in, if they only have one thing they need to move in a month, it's probably not worth the effort to get them a Gateway account so they can put that one request in. We probably would look at an alternate method of entering that into the system, except, instead of through the Gateway. So we would be more concentrated, at least to start off, to look at the high volume folks. Where can we work from that point of concentration and utilize that? So again, if we're talking using it for milk, we would be looking at bulk plant or broker or someone who would have knowledge of all of the different things that are moving that day and where they need to go to put those requests in, versus having every producer who may or may not know where their milk is going until they get the check. So the other thing I want to caution is, right now all of this is in the Gateway has been hard-coded in, the lookups and everything have been hard-coded in, and we'll cover that in a minute, but we have some work to do if we're going to use it for all commodities. Address book is when they go into the Gateway, they have an address book, and so the previous slide we had their premises. So they may have premises that they own, that they deal with every day, and then they may have premises they're sending to, so they're not necessarily owning those premises. And so that's the purpose of the address book, where they can, if they're shipping, let's say for instance, a stockyard is receiving cattle into that stockyard and they're permitting those cattle into that stockyard, the stockyard could have their own address book that would have all their customers listed in it. Those premises are not necessarily the premises they own. Their only premises that they own may be the stockyard. They'd be able to go in and ad hoc add additional folks that are sellers into their address book so that they could go ahead and put that request in based on that address information. That would transfer over into the system, and then you decide whether you have a prem that exists or not based on that address, or you need to create a new one. Again, this has some potential for stockyards, for milk bulk plants, for slaughter plants where they could be receiving hogs or cattle into those locations, and ad hoc adding in the address information. Of course, this brings in the pre-established premises versus them ad hoc. So if you have pre-established premises, all that information hopefully has been verified of the location, the address, has a prem ID assigned. If they were doing this ad hoc, then you would hope that the producers would know their prem ID and be able to supply that to the stockyard and say, okay, here's my prem ID, because that makes all the verification part of it on the other end much easier versus, pre-establishing all of the premises for a particular stockyard would be pretty difficult, I think. You may have some stockyards that normally have the same customers, but there's customers that come and go. And those are things to think about, how you would handle that and how the gateway could be utilized if we were to utilize it for other species. Again, they would go in. There's obviously no request if they come in, they're brand new. They would go in, they would start to create a request, and this is the permit request. And so, again, when I was mentioning that currently it is drop downs for hard-coded poultry, because when we put this together in a hurry to get it out there for high path, that was the quickest and easiest way to get that done. That said, we are working on converting this to a different method where it basically will pull in those lookups based on the type of account, and that account defines the species that's being handled, the type of items that are being handled. So it could be flexible and be used for any commodity with that one change. But I've been working with our IT folks and contractors for a while on this, and it's something that we can probably accomplish pretty quickly, but getting those resources has been somewhat problematic. So we don't have it done yet. Caution, it's not done yet. Good news is on the inside, internally in EMRS, all of those pieces and parts are already there. We can actually do that internally, but utilizing the gateway today for commodities such as milk demonstrates how it could drop-downs could be looking differently and be handling that, but they don't currently do that today. But on the internal structure, where we basically do the same process, just not through the gateway. The gateway, again, was built to allow producers to have a window into the system, but not actually be in our system, not actually be touching anything. It's all separated in a secure, they basically have their secure web application. It's transmitted into our system through web services with a lot of security in between. But if we were wanting to permit something today and we were entering those permits, regulatory person would actually enter those permits. We have that infrastructure on the inside and internally in EMRS to do it right now. So this is an example from just using the Phoenix exercise in Kansas, that if we wanted to permit milk, in leaving out all of the implications of saying we could actually move that safely or what kind of testing is required or anything else, just saying moving the information right now for milk is possible internally within the system. It is not currently possible through the gateway, but we do feel like within a reasonable period of time we will have that capability. So again, the beauty of it is the person doing the request is basically doing the data entry. If they were filling out a fillable form, they would still have to put the same information in that fillable form. The difference here is as soon as they commit that request, it commits directly in our system without additional data entry. So it's immediately available to anybody that needs to see it, and we don't have to wait to receive that paper to type it in and go through that process. So that's where we have gained some efficiency in the process through the work that we've done with HiPath. The other advantages, especially in low volume, where folks want to know every time something happens, we can trigger off any number of different notifications, email notifications, whatever, throughout the entire process. Once it's into the system, power the system to be able to do this, those capabilities are there. Keep everyone informed that wants to be informed. But in a large-scale outbreak, we normally turn this off because everybody wants to know about the 1 a day. Nobody wants to know about the 57 a day. So we have the capability to turn those notifications on and off. And regardless of how that request comes in, whether it comes in through the gateway or whether we hand enter that directly in the system, once it's in there, from that point forward, everything pretty much occurs the same. Have a process where we look at that request and say, are we going to accept the request? Is this something that we even want to consider, or are we just going to shoot it down right now and not even pass it on? If it looks like it has the information that we need, if they gave us a request and it doesn't have any destination information, it has a P.O. box or something that we can't, we'll shoot it down right then through that request being rejected, or if it's a duplicate request, or if it's a commodity that we won't even consider. I mean, there's no use to even pass it through the process. Let's just, stop at that point. So we have that take that information that's been submitted, take a look at it. Someone who's trained said, yes, this is good or no good, and then the accepting of the request just basically promotes it up, hooks it to a origin premises, and puts it in as a pending permit so it can go into the permit approval process. That's basically all the accept request does, but it's a matter of just pushing buttons and not actually typing data in. So, again, we hope that reduces the amount of issues that we experience. Once that request gets accepted, if we are utilizing the gateway, then that producer or that requester can see that somebody's working on this. They've taken a look at my request and they're processing it, so that they're not emailing you and calling you, hey, did you get my request? You can do something with it, da-da-da-da-da. We go through all that stuff, and it's just noise in the background for getting the work done efficiently. So that feedback seems to, at least in the industry folks we've trained and the folks that have utilized it in the outbreak, that feedback loop seems to be important to them. So felt like that was a good thing with the gateway. Once that request is accepted, like I said, it basically hooks it to an origin premises and makes it a pending permit. So now we're into the real game of depending on, and again, if we look at import type permits for cattle or hogs going into a state, you're only interested really in the health of the animals where they're going in your state. But in an outbreak situation, the control area may be at the origin, it may be at the destination. There may be a control area at the origin and destination. So it's a little bit different, and we play a little differently. We want both the origin and destinations being involved. The origin looks at that permit, pending permit, and they decide if they're the control area, has this producer met the qualifications for, or capable of meeting qualifications for moving this commodity out of my location. Not their decision that they get accepted on the other end. So we have both the review for the origin saying, if I'm a free state and they're moving something from my location, or do they have capability to do the biosecurity and everything they need to do so that if the receiving state accepts them and then they come back to my state, then I'm assured that they're not returning with any kind of disease. The review process is an opportunity for the origin to take a look at the situation and decide, do we want to go further with this? And that point they can reject as well. If they feel like this is something that will work, then they can pass it on. And this part of the process with internally, I think we currently have all of the pieces and parts we need to make it work somewhat without knowing all of the parameters that may be required. At least in training and in practice, we've been able to process permits for a lot of different commodities through this. It seems to work for that. The approval process is always going to be the destination, so it's going to be where the stuff is ending up. Are you going to take it or not? Once that, if your origin and destination state are the same, then there's not necessarily a need always for the review. You can skip directly to the approval. But if the origin and destination are in different states, then both of those processes occur. So the origin state would say, are we going to let this leave here? Or have they met the qualifications before we send it to our destination state? We don't embarrass ourselves if they haven't even don't have the capability to do the testing or the requirements for the movement. But the approval process would be the destination, and then taking a look and say, do we want to take this stuff? So we have those different parts. They accept they request a permit through the gateway or another method. It goes into the system. We do a first cut of do we even accept this request or not. It goes into the origin state as a pending. Do they want to this look good to them? Do they want to recommend that it be able to be moved? And then the approval process, which is the destination state saying, do we want to accept this? And if so, what are our conditions going to be? So they can define what testing conditions, what special conditions, those kind of things. So again, this part of the process I don't think needs a lot of changes to be able to handle any commodity. We've practiced with it and it seems to work for us. The final part of that is the generating some type of document to put in their hand, and we've automated most of that at this point, where we were able to generate those documents based on all that information that's already been entered into the system, and basically, produce a PDF document with that and attach it to that permit approval. I think, again, little or no changes required here. If we're changing commodities, it's going to print off a different commodity, just like it would print off chickens. It's going to say cattle or swine or whatever. Not going to have to change anything in infrastructure to handle those things, because it's just a matter of moving that information that's been in a lookup onto a document, and I don't see any issues there. The document gets generated. If they're working through the gateway, then immediately that document is available to them. You don't have to email it to them. You don't have to, do any of the other stuff. It's in a secure environment, so it doesn't have to be attached to an email and sent. It just appears there in the gateway. They can go there. You have a number of different people in an account. You got 2 or 3 different people working for the same company that are requesting permits. They all have access to that gateway under that company account. If somebody's out, not available, if you send it to their email, they might not get, they might be off that day or whatever. That was the other thing we found useful, was they can go in and retrieve that permit. Anybody who has access can go in and retrieve that document that they want to put in their hand, immediately available. I don't think, again, this is just a mock-up. We've tried to mock up, we have an ability to add header and footer information for each specific state, so that we don't have to maintain 50 different types of permit. We're trying to use a generic type permit, but with the ability to add that specific header and footer information for those states, so that it looks specific to their state with their information for their approving officials, but not with different conditions on every permit, because that becomes really problematic. Prefer to refer to other documentation. So if you have some specific type of requirements within your state, then maybe you put a web address in here and say, please, get all these specific conditions at this location or whatever. But it's really difficult to try to put 50 different conditions on 50 different permits. So we try to just maintain this as a generic permit with specific header and footer information. Again, I think this would apply I really don't see any changes needed here to handle any other commodity. The movements part, we've tried to do, again, pass. Some folks sought a permit, and it depends on how you define a permit within your own state. Do you require an approval with every single movement? We have found that through some of the work that's been done, the lower risk type products like eggs going to a breaker, approving that for a 30-day period and then having them report every time they move that and list their test results seems to be a much more efficient process, but it can work either way. But once that permit's approved, then all they do is go back in, hit the button, and it basically copies all the information from the approved permit. They only put in the date they moved and how many items they moved, any specifics to that particular movement. So the data entry is very easy. As soon as that's committed, again, it's right in the system. We're not asking the producer to do a whole lot of work, but it's saving us a tremendous amount of time of having to hand enter that information as it comes in. So we found this to be a more efficient process. If we're doing this in other commodities, then we need to start considering, okay, if we're going to be using individual animal ID, we're going to be requiring this be connected to animal records in the system, then there may be some additional work that we need to do to accommodate that. One of the things we have planned now would be to allow them to do an attachment at this point. So if they were shipping cattle and we needed a list of all the cattle and individual IDs for this particular movement, that would get attached at this point right here, come into the system, and then maybe we convert that to individual animal records, that we're able to track those individual animal records across locations. But until all of the parameters are defined, all we can do at this point is anticipate that we would at least be able to start off with attaching of a spreadsheet with all the IDs and go from there. So that is in the plan now. It's in the work plan that we have. As soon as we get the resources, that will be one of the things we do here, is maybe attaching test results or attaching records of, whatever kind of supporting documentation you need. But as well, we also want to, because of the messaged lab results, we want at this point also be able to associate a messaged lab result to this particular movement. Currently, if they are required testing, like in the recent outbreak in Tennessee, Alabama, we had them list in their test date, in the test date field, we had them list the accession number and the date of the test, but we could cross-reference that to message results. But we'd very much like to be able to associate those results right here to this movement. Then we can do more error checking, automation, those type of things. But that would be the biggest thing I see right here that we would need to have before we could utilize it for the other commodities. So again, as soon as that movement is created in the system, it's immediately available. So if you're going across state lines, it would be immediately available to both states. The visibility would be there. We could trigger a notification if necessary, saying they're going to be shipping this load, in the morning, whatever. So all of that is already there. I don't really see anything there that would need to be to change for other commodities. And again, the permit being a document that says, here's our overall agreement, here's what the conditions you need to meet for each movement, here's the span of time you've been approved for movements, all those things would be on a permit. Permitted movement would actually contain the specifics about the date it was moved, any kind of testing for that particular movement. Again, we may have IDs at some point listed on the specific animals that moved if we're looking at other commodities. So there could possibly be a little work done here, but overall we have most of, I think, what we need for other commodities. So that's kind of an overview of what we have and where we are and what's available. And, would like to say that, I feel like we have most of what we need internally within the system to move any commodity. Gateway, I want to make it very clear that right now it's hard-coded poultry, and until we have that updated to utilize other lookups. It is not available for other commodities at this point, is in our plan. Answer any questions, Liz, that you have received?
Okay, yeah, so if we can, I do have a couple questions that have come through the chat. The first one is, do the secure supply plans dictate how far in advance of a movement a permit be requested?
I don't know that there's specifics on how far in advance, but in the past, permits were not approved until, if it was required testing, they were not approved until the testing was in hand, which can be problematic because of the turnaround on testing time. So some of the work that's been done with the industry and all in the poultry has been that they actually request the permits ahead of time, and then they supply needed elements such as testing at the time of the movement. If that movement occurs at 2 o'clock in the morning, as long as they list their test results, come back in the morning and check them, and that varies by states whether they're willing to accept that or not. But I don't know that there's anything in the, I'm not a expert on all of the secure food supply plans, but I don't know that they define you can request one 24 hours or 48 hours in advance, or that you should request it in any specific time frame.
Okay. The next question is, there some type of verification to ensure the origin or destination premises of the movement is actually within a control area so that unnecessary permits do not clog the process?
Yeah, so with AI now, that was one of a big concern before, because it was sometimes difficult with fast-moving outbreaks to determine. With the AI, we have an automated zone processing within EMRS. So if we're using the regular control zones, the system actually statuses any premises that falls within that zone with a zone status. Now, what we haven't done at this point is expose those zone statuses in the gateway to the producers. So that's something we again have on our list, is they would end up with a star next to all the premises that were in a control zone. But there's other methods. For instance, Minnesota has a method where they use a map that's available to the industry that shows them which prems are in those zones. But with us internally, we can tell now through the automated zone processing, we can look at a prem and determine whether or not it's in a zone just by looking at the status on that prem.
Okay. The next question is, am I correct to assume these permits involving a control area and movements between states would be in addition to CVIs required by the receiving state?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So, the movement permit we're discussing with secure food supply only really pertains to animals that are within control zone. There may be, and we're only looking at the particular disease that we're there for. So the requirements for those animals to move under a permit, if it's being done through secure food supply, would only be looking at those requirements and that disease within that control zone. If there's additional requirements for other diseases, obviously that's covered under the CVI and the normal movement. So that's a good distinction. Is no, we're not looking at an all or one type deal. You still have to meet your normal requirements. There may be additional requirements for animals in a control zone, and we're not really managing anything interested in tracking anything outside of that control zone because of the volume.
Okay. So what are your thoughts about the volume of traffic on the system at the same time with a disease like FMD versus more regional activity with HPAI?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
Yeah, what are your thoughts about the volume of traffic on the system at the same time with a disease like FMD versus more regional activity with HPAI?
Yeah, I mean, we always, volume's always a concern. The type of infrastructure we're using, we're trying to address all of that. We're currently have the CRM product and the gateway product that hooks into our EMRS, back end. all those are designed for, basically it's Microsoft CRM. It's designed for high volume customer relationship management through large companies. There's like 12,000 different customers that use it, large banks, large internet companies. So it's designed to handle the volume. Our infrastructure internally is being expanded, and eventually, looking at expanding into the cloud and all to handle the number of transactions. And that's something that's being looked at to make sure that if we had a large volume outbreak, that there would be infrastructure there to be able to be expanded to handle that. But the baseline, the product that's being used is built for that type of capacity if we have the capacity to handle it through our networks.
Okay. The next question is there any work being done to link the gateway permitting system to some of the State Department of Ag HERDS program in addition to EMRS?
Not to the gateway itself, because it's specific to the CRM product. There may be methods that we can then message information that's within EMRS, like a permit, to be able to either provide that as an export or some type of a message or web service that could then transfer that information into a HERDS product. But the gateway itself would not link into the HERDS, because all the security, all of the web service, the communication, all occurs directly between that infrastructure and the CRM product. But I think that once that hits the system and is an approved permit, then we have an opportunity at that point at looking at, can that be ported over to the HERDS system? And I think that's where our integration point might be. That'd be work that we need to do with IT folks to see how that could be done.
The next question is, are there any discussions about the EMRS platform evolving to include routine movement documents, such as CVIs, that are currently issued through VSPS?
No, we haven't had any discussions about routine movements. Right now we're concentrating on just being able to provide a platform for managed movements. I don't really see routine movements as a role for us. Now, accessing routine movements in an event of an outbreak, being able to query those routine movements through something like AHER, where we can use that for tracing and evaluating, the risk associated with movements that have occurred, I think is our integration point there. But I don't see it as a platform to us to manage routine movements.
Okay, we have a couple comments that came through too. One is specific to milk movement. I think access by the milk marketer, dairy co-op, or processor is an excellent idea. And the other comment is, this is my usual broken record issue. To get testing working, we need all required testing going through LMS. This has been a hard sell to the non-folks, but I think we have most of their issues, such as billing, accounting, worked out.
Well, interesting. The reason I was a few minutes late to logging on prior to this webinar was I was on a call with a business process improvement we have for AI messaging through LMS, and we've had requests from a number of states to message AI results all the time, surveillance, everything through LMS, but it's available at any time we need that. And so maybe long term that's something, and with all the different diseases we consider, is try to turn it on and use it. And so when we come to an outbreak, everything's being messaged, and it makes it a much easier process. It has saved us a tremendous amount of time in AI with the commercial premises from back day when we were getting 400 or 500 results in the afternoon and trying to type them in, versus they come in a message and they're there and we can see what's been tested and what hasn't. Electronic messaging through LMS for us in an outbreak has been a huge time saver. But then that begs again the question of, okay, so then where does that go? How does that integrate with HERDS and all that? And that's work that's being done by another group that's looking at, can we message through LMS, send it to EMRS, what's needed in EMRS, send what's needed to HERDS, that type of thing. So all of that work is we're finally at a point where the technology is there, and it's more of making things happen and solving the political issues around that. But there is technology now that probably can accomplish those things.
Okay, great. Do we have any additional written questions or verbal questions?
Ladies and gentlemen, please feel free to place yourself into the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. You will hear a notification when your line is unmuted. At the time, please state your name and question. At this time, we don't have further verbal questions.
Okay, we do have another written question. Being the gateway is intended for large volume users, isn't it much more efficient for large users to batch load their producers' pins into EMRS ahead of time?
Yes, it is, and that's exactly the method we've used with the commercial poultry industry, is getting those prims loaded ahead of time. So in the event of an outbreak, in a matter of minutes, actually, we can create an account, basically push a button, and it makes those prims available immediately to them in the gateway to start the request process. And that was sort of the point I was making with the differences between the integrated industries and the beef cattle industry being less integrated, is how do you get those pins ahead of time, and how's that process going to work? So if we're talking, dairies, do we go through the bulk plant, the broker, the dairy veterinarian? How do we get ahead, get a hold of what would be needed for that ahead of time, and where do we congregate that information in the most efficient manner at a point of concentration that would allow that volume to go through the gateway?
Okay. Do we have any other written questions?
Not at this time.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank everybody that joined us today. We are going to have another webinar on Tuesday, January 30th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time discussing the position of the case manager. We're also hosting a webinar on February 6th to introduce the niche stakeholder working group and outline the work they've done in FY17 and the work they plan to do in the future with the help of APHIS across the country. So we hope you can join us for our next webinars. And have a great afternoon, everyone. And thanks again, Fred, for doing this webinar today.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining today's conference. The call has now concluded, and you may disconnect.